The lesson of history is that you don't get a sustained economic recovery as long as the financial system is in crisis. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the reality concerning the country's current state of the economy. Joining us this evening to discuss all this and more are Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst, Verity Research, Dr. Roshan Pereira, Senior Research Fellow, Advocata Institute, once affiliated to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka as well, Manjul De Silva, CEO of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, as well as N.R. Gajendran, tax specialist. Joining us this evening on the show to pose questions from our panelists. On to my immediate right is Roaz Irfan. On to my immediate left is Attorney at Law, Sharon Benedict. And on to my far left is debutant Attorney at Law, Ravindu Jayakudi. So these three, the two gentlemen and the lady would pose questions from the panelists as we go along on Face the Nation tonight. So let's start off tonight's show on the topic, the reality concerning the country's current state of the economy. Let's start off tonight's show with Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst, Verity Research.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to the show. I think 2023 was a new year, and what we are looking forward for this year should be ideally with the IMF program securing the board level agreement and also securing your creditor negotiations, making sure you complete debt restructuring negotiations. The government has put in their plan, or at least they've said expected timelines. They expect the board level agreement by Jan and also to complete debt restructuring negotiations in the second quarter of 2023. And the budget was also out. We saw what the government is planning on doing. But there are also concerns on is the government being able to meet its target. We know that there were unprecedented increases in revenue that the government is expecting. A few of the tax policy changes have come in, but we're yet to see any progress on the international front in terms of the IMF board level agreement and the creditor negotiations, which I think are two crucial things that we need to focus on completing this year.
Raj, you spoke about the IMF board level agreement coming into play in January. Then you said about the debt restructuring program coming into play this year, 2023. However, we have seen views being expressed by the governor of the central bank on this very show last year, stating that the agreement would come into fruition by the end of December. This has not happened. So how optimistic are you about all this?
Again, like I said, these were government projections, and even in the investor update that happened later in 2022, they said December, and now the target has been pushed to January. I think realistically speaking, we have to expect February because it's already been 2 weeks into Jan, and we don't see a lot of progress. We see a state of limbo. So best scenario, you see the board level agreement somewhere close to February, and even debt restructuring negotiations towards the end of 2023 is your best bet.
Can I safely say all this what's happening right now in Sri Lanka, as far as the country's economy is concerned, is all a farce?
The problem, I think, is that the government continues to be very optimistic in its targets and deadlines. So whenever the government sets targets, I think even people and economists, academics, business community, we tend to add a few. We tend to add a few delays, and that's something that you expect. So I think what we have to really look forward for is what is the government planning on doing. You see certain improvements coming in, like cigarette taxes going up, which I think is a problem as well. But beyond that, you see certain good things that the government is doing. However, the setting of targets and being extremely optimistic is a recurring theme. So over the past 17 years, the government has never met its budgeted revenue targets. So this optimistic target continues in setting the board level agreement and also completing debt restructuring negotiations. So we're yet to see any progress because there's a lack of transparency on where the negotiations are so far.
And we will all have to wait until the cows fly over the moon. I now move attention to Dr. Roshan Pereira, Senior Research Fellow, Advocata Institute, once affiliated with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka as well, with regard to your thoughts on our topic tonight.
So just to sort of bring a little bit of a positive spin to it, since I was with you on the show probably early last year really, I think we have seen some things, some changes. Just acknowledging that we have an economic crisis, I think, was a huge step in the right direction. Beginning our negotiations with creditors, I think, is again something that we had been asking for many years, in fact. We've started that, and we've also brought in the IMF. So I think we have put in some things in place. As Raj said, yes, there's still a long way to go in terms of in finalizing some of these things, but I think at least we are moving in the right direction. And as well as we have reversed some of the missteps or the bad, catastrophic, I would say, economic policy decisions that were made. Some of them have been reversed, like the exchange rate, holding on to the exchange rate, the tax policy changes, and also the ban on chemical fertilizer. And because of some of those changes, I mean, there has been, you can see some kind of stability on the external side and on the internal side. What do I mean by that? On the external, basically, you can see that there is definitely a contraction in the external sector deficits because of very tight import controls, of course, but also and also the fact that we have stopped paying external debts. And also there has been some kind of, I mean, exports did relatively okay in 2022, though towards the end of the year we have seen some kind of reversal. So on the external side, I mean, we have managed to kind of contain it. Of course, there are other implications as a result. And on inflation, which is the domestic stabilization, we can see inflation is coming down. Yes, it's still too high. It's at levels we have not experienced in any of our lifetimes. So there is still way to go, but I think the right policy decisions have been made in terms of reining in aggregate demand, right? So interest rates have been raised, taxes have been brought in. So I think the policies are there, and that there is the right policy direction, but certainly there's a long way to go. As Raj said, I think the fiscal sector is, I think, the area that needs a lot of focus. Yes, we have increased taxes, but when you see the revenue collection, at the moment we're only seeing sort of the increase. We're going back to sort of the pre-2019 levels, right? And
at least, Dr. Roshan, we are seeing economic theory being put into practice, and that seems to be working in Sri Lanka at the present context, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the demand management is happening, but of course we have, right, as I said, the fiscal sector, I think, is the one area that I think there needs to be much more focus on the tax, because we basically had a tax to GDP for 8%. We've got to increase it to 15%. There's a lot of pushback on paying taxes because of the increases in taxes. I think people need to understand why we need higher taxes.
We'll talk about that momentarily, Dr. Roshan. I promise you I'll get back to that question in a bit. Let's now talk to Manjul De Silva, Chief Executive Officer of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. What are your thoughts on this topic that we're talking about today, the reality concern in the country's economy?
Yeah, Shamil, I will also agree with Dr. Roshan on that. I mean, basically, we seem to be on the sort of right direction as far as policy is concerned. I mean, you can see certain steps being taken to enhance revenue. I mean, the taxes, I mean, though it's going to hurt a lot of people, I mean, we feel that is something that's kind of unavoidable in order to get out of this mess. Interest rates were raised to control inflation, and certain reforms have been proposed. We have still some concerns, some doubts about the execution. I will come back to that sometime later on. But at least as far as the policy direction is concerned, I would agree. I mean, at least we are on the correct path. I mean, we have approached IMF. We are working towards getting a deal with IMF. We are working on debt restructuring. So all that is basically, I mean, what all of us have been wanting the government to do, and which was not happening.
Manjula, what is this right direction that you're talking about? 20 liters of fuel for a week, 2.5 hours of power cuts every single day, not being able to go out and purchase the goods that you require when needed. Is this the right direction? Isn't this all a gimmick right now?
All what you are seeing today are actually the results of certain bad policies that were followed some time back, So it's not something that has been caused by what is being done today, but really the outcome of bad policies which all of us saw being practiced a couple of years ago. right? So now what we are seeing is an effort to get out of that mess, and that's not going to happen in a day or two. Actually, even today, talking for business, because that's my responsibility as representing the business community. I mean, business sector is also facing a lot of challenges, some of which are in a way unavoidable, but at the same time, I think we need to address them sooner or
Manjula,
later.
I'm surprised. You know why? You are representing the business community. Look at the taxation on business or exports right now, 30%. Withholding tax, 5%. Look at the interest rates at 33% or so. How can SMEs survive in this context?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was coming to. I mean, there are some issues, right? For example, the interest rates, I mean, at current levels, I mean, this is hurting a lot of businesses, SMEs, as well as some even large businesses, I mean, who are highly leveraged, are facing a lot of stress at the moment. So that is something which needs to be addressed sooner than later. But then once again, I mean, like I told you, I mean, the government had no choice but to raise interest rates in order to control inflation, right? Which is now beginning to come down due to those actions. But hopefully, if the inflation keeps subsiding, then maybe we will see the interest rates also coming down. But apart from that, let me also tell you, like, okay, the couple of other challenges which sometimes are not spoken enough of. Like one is, the government owes certain private sector companies huge amounts of money, right? And this is in rupees, not in dollars, right? And no effort is being made. I mean, we all know that the government is cash strapped, but then at the same time, this is putting enormous strain on certain sectors like construction. I mean, some companies are really suffering. I mean, they might even go under very soon. Renewable energy sector, I mean, we want the renewable energy industry to grow, but they are paid for a long time. And
so you speak about Manjula, lawmakers in the country are at fault over the last few years. Even the president, who took over office a year ago, that is Ranil Wickremesinghe, has been a lawmaker in Sri Lanka for nearly 47 to 48 years. Look at Mahinda Rajapaksa, for an example, has been in politics for 50 years. And unfortunately, the people have to bear the brunt of what's happening in the country. I now move my attention to N.R. Gajendran, tax specialist.
Shamira, you said the reality of the situation currently. Can I add an adjective and say tawdry reality? And explain that with a simple number, which is affecting each and every person in this country in a different, some way or other, including all of us. So you had 100,000 rupees before all this happened and before COVID. At that time, the taxes, the consumption taxes was 8% VAT, and the highest marginal rate of income tax was 18%. That's also over 9 million income. Up to 9 million, you paid only 540,000. So if you had 100,000 rupees for consumption, what will happen? 8,000 will go for consumption tax. You have to pay 18,000. That will be 26,000. You will have 74,000 rupees in real sense of purchasing power in your hand, the money, where you can buy goods to the extent of 74. Now what happened now? Indirect taxes have gone up, VAT is 15%, social security contribution levy is 2.5%, it is cascading tax, so effectively about 3.5–5%. Say consumption tax will settle down at 20,000. Then from 100,000 you have to pay at the highest marginal rate, earlier over 9 million rupees. Now if you are getting 300,000 rupees a month or more, that is if your income is more than about 3.7 million a year, you will pay 36,000. So the base has shrunk. So you will pay from 100,000 rupees, 36,000 and 20,000 goes off for taxes. That is 56,000, 44,000. Then our rupee depreciated almost by 100%. It was very, 180, 200, now 360, 370. So that 44,000 rupees come here to half it, it becomes 22. The economists will say the supply chain mismatches, the demand and supply mismatch. The prices have soared now. Most of the goods and prices are essential goods and things are about 3 to 4 times. So you have to bring that by another half. So virtually you have 11,000 rupees in cents to purchase 74,000 rupees. That is the reality of the situation.
Gajendran, interestingly, when you look at this equation or look at the tax regime right now in the country, it seems that the government is placing its trust on the tax collector than the taxpayer, who are supposed to be the citizens of this country. There is a mistrust even there.
Yeah, basically, taxes are not generally unpleasant. Any tax is unpleasant for an individual because your income, your wealth, it's being taken away. If not by for law, if someone comes and takes, it's robbery. So it is unpleasant always. But when it becomes unbearable, what happens? It loses its legitimacy, right? Legitimacy. And when it loses its legitimacy, it's not going to help help the government. It can only destroy government. Last government was brought down by reducing the taxes precipitously. Now it has gone up. Now if you see all the challenges on the tax increases on taxes, people are talking, normal folks are talking about taxes. Your question is, the collector means you are talking the withholding agent, right? You are saying
yes,
the withholding. Statutory agent, withholding agents, employees are withholding agents. A person who provides the service and the payment who receives the payment, he is a withholding agent. The payer is a withholding agent. The system has to work in a system where we have self-declaration is the basis world over, right? Only most of the countries where the tax at source happens is the PAY, employee taxes, ubiquitous form of tax, because the sake of convenience and particularly the employment income, generally no deductions, no expense deductions, because the employees are not supposed to incur any expenses in performing their employment. So then if the withholding agent you are trusting, but at the end of the day, the taxpayer can be marginalized and harassed if the withholding agent doesn't perform his statutory functions. We have had that experience before.
Thank you very much, Enal Gajendran, tax specialist. Whatever happens in Sri Lanka, one thing is clear. There has to be a complete stop to corruption that is rampant in the country. We've seen this in the last few months, we've seen in the last few years, we've seen in the last few decades, and we will probably see this in the future as well. I feel sorry for our citizens of this nation. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. Onto my immediate right, as I said before, Ruhaza, attorney at law, Shalan, and attorney at law, Ramindu. Ramindu's first time on Face the Nation. Let's start off with Ramindu. Yes, Ramindu.
Thank you, Shamir. Talking about the way forward, my first question goes to Mr. Gajendran. Mr. Gajendran, now the recent amendment that was brought to the Inland Revenue Act lowered this taxable income threshold. It is actually a good move. But many say that what this amendment should have done is to strengthen the administration of taxes, the collecting process. It seems like they have gone to the lowermost fruit. What do you think about this? What more could they have been added to this amendment to strengthen this administration of taxes or the collection?
You're talking, when you say administration of tax, you're referring to the tax
Mainly,
the Department of Inland Revenue?
Yes.
Not the collecting agent, what Samira referred before?
Yes.
Correct. So now, basically, taxes are inevitable because you have to meet your, say, for education, healthcare, for social security payments, for marginalized people, you need money, right? You need money. But your point is whether administration is weak.
Yes, because recently, even in Parliament, one of the parliamentarians criticized that these large-scale businessmen, they are not actually paying these taxes.
Yes, that is the enforcement mechanism. One of the reasons is the evasion in this country. With the enforcement mechanism has failed, or substantially it's substandard. which may be true. But if you want to put things into order, what Samira said, you have to put things to order at the top. You can't put things to order at the bottom. Samira will look at his boss and see how they are performing, and he will follow. He can't do something else what his boss is doing. So this has to start. I say the fish things from the head. If you want all these people to do their job properly, I can't say as a boss, do what I say, don't do what I do. If I say something, you have to do that. I am going to do that.
So you're saying tax the top? Is that what you're saying?
No, it has to come from the top.
What has to come from the top?
The leadership.
The leadership.
The compliance culture.
Okay.
Right? Leadership of compliance culture. You may be struggling for fuel. You still have a 20-liter restrictions. But the people who make the policy, you think they don't get more than 20 liters, they will get it.
I think they get about 500 liters per.
What about the backup vehicles?
Yeah.
Look at when the army generals, when the navy commander, when all of them are going, look at the defenders that are following here. Then the restrictions don't apply.
Yeah, true.
So, but Gajendra, how does this really impact the taxpayer, the people who looks at this and, is like, hey, why am I even doing
that's
this?
the reason taxpayers are saying, look here, we don't mind paying, but all have to bear the burden. Now our expenditure has gone up from 4.4 trillion to 5.8 trillion this year. It's increasing by 1.4 trillion from 22 to 23. Defense expenditure is going from 410 billion to 550 billion. And if you see our revenue is going less than that amount, it's about 69% increase. So and people in position are saying, this is the time, at this moment of time, we can't concentrate and focus on expenditure. So you think the taxpayer can bear all these things and you can get out of this mess? No. If the budget is to be efficient, your expenditure, your revenue should be able to meet the expenditure, otherwise there's a deficit. You have to borrow, otherwise you have to start printing. And now because there is talks of saying that even in the today's media said IMF has said no more printing, now they are saying we must cut down expenditure by 5%. So it has to be universal. You can't see only the taxpayers, because the people at this point of time, it may not be felicitated only because of that the money you have, it has lost its purchasing power. Now the people may have to decide whether they are going to pay the tax or they have to meet their basic requirements.
Manjula, now Gajendra was saying that taxpayers are saying, look here, we'll pay the tax, but then it has to be the same for all. You're from the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the business community. Is that what the taxpayers are saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's really coming out loud and clear. I mean, what people are saying is, okay, I mean, we are happy to contribute, but provided there is some accountability on the part of those who are spending that money as to, where the money is going in, because still we can see, I mean, a lot of wastage. I mean, we didn't see that much of a cut, as Gajen also said, on the expenditure side. Of course, we just heard very recently that the president has asked every ministry to cut their expenditure by 5%. I think that's a good move, but that should have happened actually right up front, because I mean, there are some expenditure the government cannot get away from, like the interest cost. You can't avoid salaries, pensions. I mean, even salaries over time. I mean, you'll have to cut down the cadre, but that's not something you can do overnight. And again, government doesn't have enough funds to, say, run a VRS scheme or something like that,
But now, Manjula, when Sri Lanka's rule of law was crumbling almost during the middle of last year, and in human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression was in jeopardy, we saw, the Bar Association coming forward and saying, look here, this is not how things, you can't just go and attack protesters, you can't do this is human rights. They have a fundamental right to express themselves. Now, you say that the government needs to be more accountable, needs to be more transparent, and as a Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, what have you done to, bring this sort of accountability? Because you can't just, sit on your hands and expect them to be accountable.
No, I mean, we have been very vocal. I think Shamil and many others know. I mean, even on this show itself, I think we have come and time and again conveyed our position. We have issued many a statement. In fact, we worked very closely with the Bar Association. You can ask the Bar Association president himself how much the chamber was involved right throughout, Of course, I mean, Bar Association probably has a bit more visibility as an entity because it kind of maybe has a greater appeal to a larger community. I mean, we represent one section of the population. Probably, I guess you being a lawyer may not have seen that. But if you ask anyone from the business community, I mean, they would know how much vocal the chamber has been. Actually, we even went to the extent at one point asking the incumbent president to leave office, which I think in the entire history of the chamber.
No, but the question
right?
that I think Shalan was trying to allude to was the fact that the chamber was vocal. There's no question about there's no question about that. But it all came. You all were trying to close the stable door after the horses bolted. So it all came after. You all were vocal only after the Aragale took place. What did you all do before that? Now that's the biggest question mark. Now I'm not in any way trying to say that the Bar Association did a good job either, but all of them, it was not a reactive approach. All of them took a very.
It was a reactive approach.
No,
it was not proactive.
It was not a proactive approach.
It was reactive.
So it was very reactive.
Look here, I mean, it's like this, I mean, it's always a gradual escalation, right? I mean, you, from day one, you can't sort of, start anything with maximum intensity, right? So initial approach that the chamber took, and I know even Bar Association and most other civil society bodies took that same approach, was really to engage with the government at that time, right? Within closed doors, and we tried our level best to convince them that the path they were taking was not the right one. I mean, whether it was in relation to the exchange rate management or the fertilizer policy or whatever else that the government was doing, we tried our level best to convince them, explain to them one-on-one, I mean, with every single key policymaker who was in that administration. So when that failed, only gradually, we started coming out in the media, and then of course at some point, we supported everybody, including people who got onto the streets. So it was like a gradual escalation, right? And we were there. We were always there with everyone, adding our voice to that of others.
If I can pose this next question to Dr. Roshan now, I'm pretty sure our viewers would also agree that 10 billion rupees is a lot of money. Some of us might not even make that much during our lifetime, Shamir exempted. But however, Dr. Roshan, now there is a huge hue and cry about finding 10 billion rupees to hold Sri Lanka's local government election. We see politicians coming out and saying, look here, we can use this 10 billion to feed the poor, to pay the samurdis, but it's okay if you want an election, let's have one. You've been working at the central bank. You have a more holistic national view about the money that Sri Lanka has. So how much is 10 billion rupees really?
Well, 10 billion rupees for a household is obviously a big amount. For a country, it's not a huge amount because our expenditure is in the trillions. So it's not a huge amount. The other thing I need to clarify is that this expenditure has actually been already allocated for the elections in the last budget. So if you want to reallocate it to something else, basically you have to go to Parliament and get approval to do that. So I don't know whether, originally when they came up with the budget, then these conversations should have been there. We have 6 weeks or 4 weeks of debates on the budget. And if you go through that, these questions should have been asked at that time.
They weren't.
Not now, exactly. So I don't think that is really the issue, is not whether it's still be there. But what I would like to say is really, we've had protests on the streets for months actually. And that was a way in which people expressed their opinions really. And I think the chambers and businesses probably don't want that kind of protest again. And an election is really a legitimate way in which people can express their opinion. So I think it should be allowed. You should allow the election to take place because that's a legitimate process rather than.
And this 10 billion was in the budget that was passed in Parliament several months ago?
Yes.
So every politician who comes out and says, we don't have money for the election is a liar.
Well, they probably, I don't know whether they've read the budget estimates. There are massive books like this, which everybody, I think they all get a copy of it. And basically it is in the budget. Of course, you can reallocate. But what I'm saying is 10 billion is not a huge amount. Even the Samuddi, I mean, say what you pay for salaries and pensions is much higher amount. Even the Samuddi payments are much more. So I don't think it's a matter of the quantum is the issue. But certainly in terms of expenditure as a whole, we need to have much better expenditure management.
So, Dr. Roshan, you've been working with...
Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised. You know why Sri Lanka? There was a time in Sri Lanka that the president who chaired the cabinet meeting got to know what was happening in the cabinet meeting the next day morning in the papers. That is this country.
That is a bit surprising, and that I would like to talk about the institutional framework and actually the responsibilities.
You are saying that the number was put in the thick books that they received as parliamentarians, because usually when the first reading of the budget takes place, the books are distributed amongst the 225 members of parliament. And they clearly saw that 10 billion was put as an expenditure in this financial year that we're talking about. And now they're saying that the money is not available. It is surprising.
So I think there again, it's a matter of ability to, or not ability, but the technical, I mean, having people there to analyze these numbers, because obviously everybody can't go through these massive books. So I think there again, having this whole thing of a budget office, an independent institution where anyone across the aisle can actually get information on budget numbers, I think is vital, because transparency is vital actually. And when you have all these numbers, obviously every MP or every minister is not going to have access to that kind of expertise.
But Dr. Roshan, when you say independent budget office in Sri Lanka, we tend to use the word independent quite loosely to mean, appear independent, but not really. Also, Dr. Roshan, since, you have such a broad knowledge on the economy of Sri Lanka, since there is so much of talk about, holding the election, should we hold the election or should we reallocate the money for, feeding the poor or some of the payments? What is your analysis like on the return on this investment? Like, would it be better to hold the election, use this 10 billion, hold the election, or would it be better to really, put a pause on it for a minute and maybe, spend it on the poor?
So I'm an economist and not a political analyst, so I don't know.
The effect that it would have on the election, like we
even
spend
in terms of economic governance.
Yes, we spend 10 billion, have an election, it'll have a certain effect on the economy. We don't spend 10 billion, we don't have an election, we spend it on something else, that will have an effect on the economy. Judging by the two outcomes, which is better?
Because this is the local government election we are talking about.
Yes.
This doesn't create much impact on the national policy. This is like the village election.
Yes, so I think the issue is, do elections have to be held in terms of the law of the land?
Let's just forget that for a second.
Yes.
No, so I think that is important, because if elections have to be held, they have to be held, and that may be why the money was allocated. But I think I would rather go to the expenditure analysis and go around and again look at these budget estimate books and see where is there a granular analysis being done on where this expenditure is going. You have a cabinet spokesman coming out and saying, okay, or the president saying, okay, we're going to cut 5% of all ministries. Is that a legitimate way of reducing expenditure? Because do you want to reduce on education, on health, on social welfare, or what are the areas? I mean, we know Mr. Gajendra talked about military expenditure on military. This is 14 years of plus from the civil conflict. That is still one of the largest expenditures in the government, in the budget, when we don't have a conflict. Whereas actually I would say we need to have a war on poverty and hunger and inequality really, where really the expenditure really should go to those. And for that, I think you can reallocate expenditure forget this 10 billion, that as I said is not a huge amount. Reallocate expenditure within the existing allocation.
And don't forget, Ramindu, in 2018, when the local government election was held in Sri Lanka, that was the turning point of the political trajectory in Sri Lanka. That is where the Sri Lanka Pojana Peramuna was fielded as a party, and they won
the first time.
We are fighting that this country should remain democratic.
But I think what Ravindra really meant was that it doesn't have an effect on the
not
policy changes.
That's situation like this on the crisis.
That's ultimately going to give the political direction to the country. As
that's
to
not the point.
Which country?
That's not the point, Samir. The fulcrum of democracy, rule of law. If rule of law to be in place, there must be legitimacy and mandate for the people who make decisions, policy. Now, this was actually being questioned by the people. 2.5 years down the line, they have questioned, and we don't have a right of recall. Now, when under our system of governance, we have parliament, we have provincial council, we have other governance, municipal councils. Now, if you are, that system has to work, and if you are talking of ₹1 trillion for expenditure for the election, 10 billion rupees out of 6 trillion, 5.8 trillion rupees is not even a fraction, less than 1%. Can't you, I mean, you can't find that 10 billion when some expenditure is going up by about 30%.
So Raj, interesting, I want to come to Ruhaza in a minute, but I just want to pick Raj's brain on this round. We were able to speak to Gajendran, Manjula and Dr. Roshan, but we were not able to give you an opportunity. So I'm going to direct a question that was posed by a viewer tonight on Face the Nation. How can we be on the right track when nothing is being done to increase production, increase exports, reduce expenses, and build a dynamic economy?
So I think that is an important question. I think that was also partly answered here. We have the right policies in place, but none of it, and some of the policies in place are also questionable. But we are in the right path to meet those targets. So we're still on that road, and we have many milestones to meet, and we haven't met any of those milestones. It's getting in the right path itself took us all this time, and that's why we are in the right direction. But we have to build all of these as part of like a medium-term plan.
Raj, remember you came on this very show a couple of months ago, and you said you're very pessimistic with regard to the government's projections.
I still am.
And now you're sitting on the show today and you're saying, in a few months from now, things are going to be hunky-dory, and is it going to be like that?
It is definitely not. Yeah. But what I'm saying now is that we were before in the wrong path. We kept saying, we don't need to go to the IMF, we don't need debt restructuring, and now we are in the right direction.
But Raj, when you say we kept saying,
we did.
It's the government.
It's the lawmakers in this country.
Yeah, but even now, talking about your projections, the budget basically announced 140 billion revenue from cigarette taxes. And in order to do that, the government increased cigarette tax revenue by 20%. But what's interesting is that 20% is going to give you your 140 billion. The 20% increase is only going to give you 92 billion. So in order to get your 140 billion, you need to increase your cigarette taxes by 147%. We have done the math, and this math is published.
147%.
147%.
It was increased only 20%.
Only 20%.
So then how does the government really justify that? Just this fly?
That's my pessimism over government.
But Raj, just in your opening remarks, you said cigarette taxes have been increased.
That's
good news.
He's saying it's not increased enough.
It's not increased enough. It's a good thing that we have gone 20% because we've been advocating to increase cigarette taxes for quite some time. And what I'm saying is that the pessimism over the projections is that you start your year and you announce your cigarette taxes and you don't do it enough. So that, again, anyone who can do the numbers would realize that government is not in the right track to meet its budget target. But in terms of policy, yes, we have central bank policies in terms of exchange rate, in terms of like IMF, in terms of debt restructuring negotiations. That seems to be in place. But fiscally, we have to work on our projections. And that is where the question comes in, where is the analysis?
No, but the question real now is, isn't the government simply firefighting and not trying to strengthen the country's economy?
The government currently now is has to meet meeting the revenue target itself is some sort of firefighting, because you need to create that credibility that you can meet a target, and that is when you get some sort of credibility to get your restructuring negotiations sorted, or even your IMF board level.
But why must we be satisfied, Raj, with 20 liters of fuel? Why must we be satisfied with 2.5 hours of power cuts every day?
I think
that shouldn't be the status quo of this country.
That is definitely not the status quo. But
that is current right now.
That shouldn't be what your...
It shouldn't be.
That shouldn't be your ideal target. But I think that is what we're suffering for previous policy actions, and corrective measures take a bit of lag.
So look at the statements that are being issued. The Minister of Power and Energy is saying that if the electricity tariffs are not increased, the prices are going to go up and there are going to be prolonged power cuts in the country. They are threatening the people again and again.
I think the question we need to ask back is, if the tariffs go up, what is the analysis that we are going to recover our losses from the CEB? Because even what we're seeing now is we're seeing PUCSL documents, and we haven't seen any conclusive evidence that this tariff hike is going to make sure that we are going to make enough revenue, or we are going to make CEB profitable. And that is why I think people are also concerned over why am I getting a tariff hike when there's no justification as to what is the return I'm going to get. And that you can see that throughout.
Raj, let's now talk about the IMF bailout program. So now we know today was the day that people got their pensions into their account, and the Samudhi is still pending. Now, one of the recommendations made by the IMF was to create a safety network to the most vulnerable in the country.
Yes.
Can Sri Lanka actually afford this safety network? Because the Samudhi is still pending, and they've got their pensions late as well. They have to survive with this current situation as well.
So we don't know what exactly the IMF wording is social safety nets. We haven't seen what the social safety net program is. And what's announced in the budget were also Samudhi payments and done through Samudhi itself. I think currently what the IMF would be focusing on, at least what we know, is the prior actions. And some of the prior actions were the interim budget, the annual budget for 2023, the monetary law, and also reforms on the, I think it was reforms on the electricity and fuel prices. So those were prior actions that were announced, that were made public via the Q&A of the Ministry of Finance. So social safety nets program, even though it was on the target list, it was not part of the prior actions, at least that was made public. And we have checked marked the interim budget, we've checked marked the annual budget. There is a monetary law that has been approved by cabinet, we haven't seen it yet. Cost reflective fuel prices on electricity and fuel is something that you can always question, but we haven't seen a methodology published. So I think that is what the prior actions need to be met before we can get the board level agreement, plus the creditor assurances.
So but Raj, there was a fuel pricing formula, right? There was a
pricing formula.
Was or is?
We don't know, because what the fuel pricing formula kept
Raj, who knows? Who on the panel knows?
So we have something called the fuel price tracker. That is where in 2018 there was a fuel price formula that was announced, and we use that formula and we map out the cost.
That was during Mangal Samaraveera's time?
That was during Mangal Samaraveera's time. So
I think the current government said that is extremely bad when they took it up.
So the thing now is that there's no published formula. There's a cost breakdown that you see on Twitter, but there is no formula per se that we've seen. The only formula we have is Mangala Samaraveera's formula, and that doesn't really tally with the market price. The market prices are way higher, and the formula prices are quite low. So,
but if you look at it, now, Dr. Roshan, I usually travel a little bit. When you go to other countries, the fuel prices are much more higher than in Sri Lanka, actually. And we probably are paying the lowest fuel prices compared to world market prices. So the prices actually need to rise, isn't it, in terms of the market forces, Dr. Roshan?
So I think in terms of the fuel prices, as Raj said, I think that has been increased to a level that I think more than covers the cost of production. But in terms of the electricity tariff, I believe it is still below. The tariffs are still below the cost reflective or the cost pricing, although we as I said, we don't know the actual cost, but people who have actually calculated it say that it's below cost. So continuing continuing with a price which is below cost, the CEB is going to continue to make losses. So that is unsustainable. We have seen that, because the only way that they bridge those losses is by borrowing, and here it's not borrowing on the market, but borrowing from the banks.
But Dr.
which has
Roshan,
had a
the
huge impact on the
PUCSL has
banks.
said that the CEB has been making operational profits for the past whatever months since they increased the tariff, and that there is no reason to increase it. Are you disputing that?
So I don't know, because I don't know anything. I mean, I don't know the actual tariff structure.
Right.
Actually, a lot of people don't know it. This is where transparency is really important, because then people, if they know that the cost of production is lower than your price, yes, you will be willing to pay it. But there is kind of a black box there. People don't know how it's done, and I think that's where transparency is really important. I think the point is that we can't continue to sustain these losses, because we have borrowed, to the hilt. We know the impact of what this borrowing has
Dr.
had
Roshan,
on the rest
now
of the
a lot of
economy.
these losses that you speak of, say for example, fuel. Now, we hear in the news quite constantly that a fuel tanker is anchoring in the harbour and then waiting to be unloaded. Why aren't they being unloaded? Because we have not made the payments, right? And then you have to pay demurrage in millions and millions of dollars. So all of that also goes into this cost, right? So the people have to pay that at the end of the day. Is that really fair?
No, so absolutely. So I think I go back to the institutional structure of how are decisions made. You have this one institution, the CEB, you have the PUCL, you have the Ministry of Finance. So there are so many players, but there is no what is the decision? Who really makes the decisions? And are those decisions transparent? So I think one of the things, that is one issue, but also have we actually built the kind of low-cost electricity generating plants? We've had this long-term generation plan, but have we actually
Acted on it.
Acted on that? Have we actually implemented that? So I think that's where people, that's what people need to question, and we need to put those right, because there's no point dwelling on the past, because the past, we have to deal with those issues. But I think the issue, I think for me, we need to put the systems right going forward and the institutional frameworks right going forward, so that we don't make the same mistakes in the future. So that we have a proper structure, all the procurement processes, everything must be much more transparent, so that in the future we don't make the same mistakes we made in the past, which is why we are in this situation. So I think, yes, we need to deal with the past, but I think looking into the future and ensuring that those institutional structures are put in place, I think is kind of our responsibility and what we really should be asking for.
And advocating for as well at the end of the day. Manjula, interestingly now, a few months ago, when I was traveling overseas, I went to the airport. It was so difficult to get some US dollars or currency from the banks located at the airport. And the answer that most of the banks gave to me was that they did not have dollars. But I went overseas a couple of weeks ago, and me being the journalist I am, I inquired once again, not that I want to get some dollars, I inquired once again from these banks, the same banks, whether I could get some dollars. And what they told me was, we have dollars and we can give you up to $5,000. And this was a claim made by all the banks at the airport. So there is a dollar liquidity in the market right now, isn't it?
Yeah, actually the situation has improved somewhat. It's not completely out of the woods yet. But like you said, compared to say a few months ago, I would say attribute it to a few reasons. One is that, as I think Roshan also mentioned, the imports have come down significantly. I think if you take January to November, the import bill had come down by something like 8% or so, right? And the exports have grown by about 4%. So there is a bit of an improvement on the trade deficit side. Then tourism earnings, still very small, but it's still, beginning to grow. Remittances since September have started improving. Plus, of course, don't forget the fact that, the debt payments we used to make, which used to take up quite a substantial amount of currency, is now being retained. So with the help of all this, there is an improvement in the dollar liquidity. So that is what we hear from even the importers. At one time they found it very difficult to get.
Opening an LC before was a nightmare.
Yeah.
At least now things have improved.
Yeah, it has improved, but we are also a little bit concerned because, we can't get too complacent at the same time. because I saw actually now if you take the November numbers alone, you can see an uptick in imports, right? So that is a worrying sign, because if you start relaxing, and because of course I mean there are a lot of demands also being made to relax the import restrictions. I mean some were justifiable. We also lobbied because there were some very important essential inputs required by industry, which we had to get some of those bans relaxed. But then at the same time, when you go to the supermarkets also, you begin to see far too many imported goods coming back into the market. So one has to be a little careful, because if you start thinking that everything is fine, and suddenly the imports start going up again, because the export sector is now facing a different challenge. Now they were just beginning to get out of some of the supply side issues caused by the crisis, but now they are faced with a recession in some of the key export
Especially the
markets.
garment industry.
Yeah. So there is a worry
60% drop
that there
volume.
could be a dip back again on the export side, right? So when that happens and imports start picking up, we can get back into a difficulty. So
if you look at the tea industry as a whole, Manjula, 50 million kilograms crop shortfall last year. And just because you apply fertilizer today, that doesn't mean that the crop is going to yield good results tomorrow. It will take at least 3 cycles to make sure that the crop and the soil becomes okay to properly yield. And this is going to have a negative impact as far as the export sector is concerned in Sri Lanka in the long run, because as you said before, 60% drop in volumes as far as the garment industry is concerned, which is the biggest forex earner as far as exports are concerned in the country.
Absolutely. That's why I think giving you $5,000 is a bit too much. Probably they shouldn't drop the guard, and I think they should still, I mean, maybe, be a little bit more relaxed than what they were before, but continue to maintain some discipline, because...
And all this, don't forget, Manjula, all this were private commercial banks in the country alongside with a state bank which is located at the airport departure terminal.
Samira, when I was a student,
which is long time ago.
More than 40 years ago. More than 40 years ago. Right? We with some case studies and examples, they said if when a company is struggling and suddenly you find there is cash surfacing, the signs of insolvency and you are nearing liquidation. Why? There is contraction of your business, so the need for money reduces. And if with astute leadership, there are assets you realize. Then cash comes in. Now, debts, you reschedule, you defer payments, you don't pay. Now, Sri Lanka, when we were insolvent, we were told, no, it's only a liquidity problem, financial crisis, the cash crisis, this is not a solvency issue. Now we are bankrupt. Now, but we don't have a liquidity crisis, right? So it has come to that because our business the economy has shrunk.
But that was, Gajendran, that was the case even in Argentina.
So
in 1994, when Argentina was declared bankruptcy, they still had exports working in their favor because soybean was one of the biggest exports to China at that time.
What Manjula was saying also, now we have curtailed imports, we have restricted imports, and there is rationing. And if you see the fuel prices, which would have been 500-600 million a month, now we are ending up at 4.5 billion, that is 6-7 billion, because your consumption has dropped, the prices also have dropped. It's about in the 70s. So imports earlier 20-22 billion, now up to November is 16.4, we'll end up at 18. If you see the imports, so last year was more than this year, right? Exports also, the exports have gone up to about, we end up at 13. So we have 13 billion exports. We have services of 1.5 billion to 2 billion. And then we have this inward remittances, remittances will be about 3-4 billion. We are matching 18. Billion. But early, because now we don't repay any debts.
No, but wasn't
wasn't that
That is the simple reason.
That 18 billion that you're talking about, wasn't it a few years ago that we're talking about?
No, now today, if November imports are some $1.4 billion. Up to now November is this year is about 16.8 or 16 points, so we'll end up as 18. Last year it would have been about 20. But before that, imports were more. And then don't forget, we had debt repayment, loan repayments. Every year we have forgotten we had to pay $5 billion. Not all that is not there. But that is not going to remain like this, no? So we have to, and also don't forget, as Roshan said, the exports have been dropping in the last few months. And the way it's going, even exporters, don't blame them. They will rebase to other countries.
And I know, Gajan, you are absolutely correct. I know a lot of tea companies who have opened shop in other countries. Like there is a private sector company.
Not only the large players, even the small players.
This is not a big player. This is a small player
players are
which opened up an office in Dubai
or a toehold outside the country, which they've never thought of.
Because of taxes?
Not because of the environment is
not conducive.
Taxes is one thing. Environment is not conducive for business because it's uncertainty. You don't know what is going to happen.
Gajendra, we've received a question from one of our viewers. I think that quite encapsulates the attitude of all the people towards these newly introduced taxes. So the question goes as, what is the point in paying more taxes when much of the money is going into the hands of politicians whom we all know are only interested in stealing it for themselves?
Exactly.
You agree with?
And you know, Sri Lankans, we are suffering, but most of them, they don't know they are suffering. People who are having 3 meals a day, now they are saying 40% is having 1 meal a day. They are not grumbling that way. In another country, because we are island mentalities, you know, we are happy-go-lucky people, and people even during this time, during Christmas, New Year, people spend, right? So if this country is to come into shape, all the other policy, institution, all that is to come in, but shonky, shady guys should not be making decisions, and there should be no cronies appointed for key positions. Unless those two things are...
Who shouldn't make decisions?
Shonky, shady guys shouldn't be there.
So who's making decisions now?
That's what I'm saying. They shouldn't make...
Who? Kajendra, who is it?
No.
Illusion.
The decision maker, policy makers at the highest level is the parliament. You don't know that? It's the parliament.
No, when you say parliament, there are few members in the opposition as well who can make decisions. Are you referring to the people who are...
Generally, this is the culmination of...
you are talking about the president.
No. I am talking, president is he's the president, no. People
but isn't he the ultimate decision maker?
No. No. It's the parliament. President can go and ask for monies for taxes. But the parliament, even the court, I'll read that decision of the court case also if you want at a point, where they said, look here, the parliament should satisfy itself. The money is required, is in fact required, and is going to be spent to the benefit of all and not for few.
Yeah, with a comprehensive majority in the government.
That is the reason.
Rajendran, what's the point of having checks and balances when it comes to even law?
Sorry?
What's the point of even having checks and balances when it comes to law?
No, it has
when
to
the
be there,
government,
three
when
pillars,
the government has
there's 3 pillars, no.
On paper.
It has to work in a democracy, and I think the judiciary is working.
On paper it's there.
So it is your responsibility to make
and that's what we are doing right now, Gajendra. We are having you on the show. And we're talking about all this, but you are not answering the questions.
What is the question I didn't answer? You never asked me a question now.
Can I just add something to this question actually? I think all these years, we have not realized that we have been paying our taxes because it has come through indirect taxes and not direct taxes. And as a result, we have not held our governments accountable. We get excited at the time of the budget, but thereafter we go to sleep until the next budget. I think this is a good wake-up call to all citizens because now we're suddenly realizing we are actually paying for the taxes. So I think we should now start holding our governments holding the government accountable for what they spend and how they spend.
Dr. Roshan, now in 2019, before Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into play,
the tax percentage was 24% for the upper threshold. Who reduced it? The government in play reduced it. Did the private sector ask for it now? The best example is Manjula. Manjula is representing the private. Did the private sector ask for it, Manjula?
No.
They did not.
No.
They went ahead, lessened the threshold, and reduced the taxes. And suddenly this government comes into play, increases the threshold from 24% to 36%, unbearable given the cost of living in the country, 57%.
Yeah, so there I will say that I think there was a need to quickly put in a tax policy or increase tax revenue. The government probably didn't have enough time to analyze, and I'm giving them the doubt. Before the next budget cycle, what I would say is you have to have a revamping of the entire tax system, because I agree with you, you can't put excessive burden on one sector of the economy.
Absolutely.
It has to be shared equally. So there are a lot of areas where there are exemptions. There are areas that are not taxed because of tax incentives. So I think there has to be a very good analysis of that entire structure and a comprehensive tax reform, actually.
Now, this
so
is not,
really
but
not
Dr. Rosen, this is not what I am saying. The opposition parliamentarians are saying the government does not even know what they will do with the money that has been collected already through this tax system that is coming into play from the 1st of January.
So that's not enough for them to spend also. No, 5.8 trillion, you are going to collect only 3.64 trillion.
No, but now Manjula, the government is saying, Ranil Wickremesinghe had said that reduced cost of government institutions by 5%. Now, one of our viewers are asking a question: has any serious effort being made to reduce costs in any government institutions? Now, what are the concrete plans?
No, that's something, I mean, we have also been raising all the time, actually, even in our post-budget statement that we issued, we did not question the tax increase. Though that is hurting business, I mean, no doubt about it, but we took it as something, we have to live with. But we raised this question, that is with regard to the expenditure, what is the plan, how are you going to reduce where it can be reduced? I mean, we still see areas, I mean, all of us can see that, right? So that there is no clear plan. Again, like, we fully understand some areas it's going to be difficult, as I told you, interest costs, the pensions, the samurdhi payments, the salaries. There are few good actions, but not enough. Like, okay, I'll just pick up one or two. They came up with this idea of allowing government servants to take no pay leave and
travel overseas.
Yeah, travel overseas. So again, we don't know how many people will actually take it up, but that's not a bad idea, right? Because if some number of people move out, so at least for a period of time, you don't have to pay their salary, right? And that's one way of reducing without incurring an upfront cost, like a VRS scheme, which at the moment the government doesn't have the capacity to afford. So that's one small thing, and then also on the this retirement age is again helping, I think, to reduce the numbers to some extent. But these are again very small steps, right? I mean, we given the current situation,
people must be retiring at 60, but they should stop recruitment as well. On the other hand,
there is currently a freeze.
Yeah.
There is a freeze on recruitment. If that is not there, I mean, But the point is, like, during the last few years, the public sector has expanded so much.
I mean, every election promise was a promise of employment. I think there were programs also named Rakia Panlakshika, Vyaprati, or some such. So they were used as an election promise. Manjula, you were speaking about the protests and how things will pan out this year. This is quite an open question to the entire panel that was sent by one of our viewers, and I think this is a pretty legitimate concern among all citizens in this country, and I believe specifically the business community that you are representing, Manjula. So the question says, can any of the panelists say with any amount of confidence that in a few months the situation won't crash back to what happened last May? Last May being the day that the Aragale was attacked and there was a retaliation, chaos all over the country.
That's a tough one. I mean, let me put it this way, like, I mean, like all of us, I think, have been saying, pretty much we have been agreeing on one thing, that, we seem to be on a particular path, right? And which we feel is the right path. But okay, we concerns about, like, how fast we are going, how much progress we are making, but at least we seem to be treading on a particular path. If we keep moving in that journey, I think we can pretty much avoid having such a situation.
Dr. Roshan, how sure are you that we won't file for default once again in the next 10 years?
So the only way that we can actually prevent that, so debt restructuring is necessary, we need to do all that, the IMF program, but I think it's this economic policy reforms which are vital, and that's what Panchal is talking about. We need to push through on the reform agenda, and we need to build consensus. I think that is what is lacking in the country. You see, mixed signals coming from, even from the policy from the highest, legislators and the public. So I think you need to bring everybody on board that the next 1 to 2 years we have to push through with this reform agenda.
But Dr. Roshan, when you say build consensus, you think that the general population of Sri Lanka, I'm not speaking about, maybe people living in Colombo, in Kandy, some of the developed cities, no, the general population, do you think that they're really in a position to understand these consensuses that we're trying to build? Can they even afford to do that on an empty stomach?
So I think that's where the media also really plays a huge role, because we can't reach a lot of those areas, and I think that's critical. I mean, we all have to tighten our belts, as you're right. I mean, there are people who, not the vulnerable, I mean, not the people who are already affected, and that's why I think the social safety net is critical and really should go in parallel. And I was a bit disappointed that, okay, we pushed on the tax reforms, but we have not really pushed on this. I think they have to go in parallel, and otherwise we're going to have problems if we don't do that. So I agree with you. You have to push on, you have to also have this safety net put in, but I think without continuing with this policy reform, and I think for that we need to educate policymakers, because you're getting mixed signals from various different people, the bureaucrats and the public, that unless we do this, what is the alternative? Do we want to go back to, as you said, I mean, this is the 17th IMF program. The reason why we've done 16 so far is because we have not completed
any of the 16.
We've completed, but not
few.
in terms of the economic reform.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about the same reform.
I'm just one question, Ravindra. Just one question to Mr. Gajendra, because you seem to be the more, what can I say, politically open. I was not saying that, Shamir. Don't put words in my mouth. So Mr. Gajendra, now there is this idea propounded by the powers that be running the country right now, and it does make some sense, because what we usually see happen in Sri Lanka is a government comes into power, they say they have a set of policies, they do something that maybe falls in line with those policies, maybe not. And then the new government comes and then just completely does a 180 on that, overturns everything that they've done, and then they do their thing. And then the next government comes again, overturns that, and they do their thing. So we're heading into a couple of election years, very important election years, because the people are angry, there's an economic crisis, change is in the wind. So this idea that, if the current government is not supported, if things change, if government change, it will be detrimental to the people and the programs that are being implemented right now. What would you say?
I don't know whether your last statement, whether majority of the people agree with that.
Which statement was that?
You said the current government has to remain for things to go through. That's what
these policies. No, I just said that there are politicians that propound that argument. Yes. My statement.
No, Sri Lanka is a small country, 22 million. We are an island nation. We don't have boundary issues with any country to have a defense mechanism. We had terrorism, that is over. We need for human living and sustenance, there are 3 basic requirements. You need air to breathe. We have plenty of fresh air compared to so many other countries. Even in the Asians, you can't walk on the street. Sri Lankans goes to some other countries, they come with their unable breathing problems. We have water, potable water. Other than pockets here and there, you get some contaminated water, shortage of water.
And some of those are also man-made issues.
Yeah, that's what I'm coming to that. We need food. Anytime you are flying every other month, when you land or take off, 365 days plush green, you see. Do you see any other country having that? We don't have weather city. So we can't be in the position, we need only little money. For what? Health, education, targeted support for vulnerable people, utilities, infrastructure, where private sector won't invest, right? Why are we going wrong? Why this there are institutions in this country, but institutions are not working. We are looking for a talisman. We are looking for a prince in the shining harbour.
DSN Kumaru.
We are looking for a magician to provide the answers.
And now you're being a philosopher.
So Shamir turned out to be right after all.
You are waiting, he was burning issue. Now, so why are we there?
No, but
because the decisions we make most of the times, and many of the decisions over the years, not just one people, it has been self-seeking, self-enhancing, and imbeciles decision. That means competent people, fit and proper people are not in key positions. Fit and proper persons are not in key positions.
because you said before also the shady people are in top positions in the country.
Yeah. Otherwise we can't be in this position. I am saying we are an island. What does this country doesn't have? It's a blessed country. Every time most of the time you are smiling. If you ask me why I am smiling, you don't know why you are smiling. We are always smiling, no?
Shamir is not smiling these days.
No.
Not with the new tax scheme.
No, he has been laughing also today.
He's crying on the inside.
So we can't be in this position, son. So if you are here, you can have all these institutions, policies, long-term, short-terms. It will be reversed because maybe for entitlement culture, that has to go off, right? And also you are a populist culture also. There's both is there, and then you feed that with. Why are you developing an entitlement? I think one of your research institutions in 2020, there were 165,000, 135,000 people were recruited who are unemployed people and unemployable graduates at a cost of 110 billion rupees in that year. In 2020, one of the either Verite or Advocata, I read it.
So, Dr. Ocean, Shamir, now talking about the countries getting down coal, medicine, fertilizer, fuel. How are we actually paying for these? Are we getting loans? And if we are getting loans, how much debt have we accumulated up until now? Since we are talking about the previous one, we are not talking about how much we have accumulated up until now.
So I think there are several ways in which we are paying for that. One is we did have a repurposing of some of the loans that were given through the multilateral and bilateral lenders for this emergency relief. So particularly for medicine, for fuel, for food, etc. So that is helped us. But also we had exports, as we said previously, we did much better. But I don't think, as Manjula also rightly said, I don't think we can rest on those. We need to. We will always need to. We are a resource deficit country. We don't have a lot of resources that are necessary for industry, particularly in terms of fuel, in terms of raw material. We will always need to import. And I think we need to change that mindset that imports are bad. We need imports in order to be able to export. But the thing is that we need to also import to export. For too long, our policies have been to protect industries, domestic industries, which have not really generated the production in terms of exporting. So I think that mindset needs to change. And that's where I think you see countries, we always talk of Vietnam, we talk of Bangladesh.
Look at Vietnam,
and we say, exactly. But if you look at their the imports and exports, they export something like $336 billion dollars worth of exports, but the imports are also 332 billion or something. They only have a surplus of 4 billion, which means that in order to export, you have to import. And I think that we need to understand. But we also need to have the right policies in place to encourage exports. Our policies have been, we've had an anti-export bias in terms of the exchange rate, in terms of tax systems, in terms of many of the policies have tariff structure has been favored domestic industries which have not really, have continued to be in that infant stage. We have not moved out of that for decades.
But Dr. Roshan, we seem to have these intellectual discussions every 10 years or so when things get really bad. Now, even back in different topics come up at different point. Now we're all talking about making the country, putting in proper policies. Back in 2015, it was all about corruption, doing away with corruption, doing away with corruption. But how certain are you, Dr. Roshan, that these policies that have been set up right now will continue in the long run? How soon is it before Parliament, realizes that they have enough money and says, okay, let's get vehicles back for all parliamentarians?
I'm not certain that that's not going to happen, but I think it's up to us to ensure that that doesn't happen, because we cannot afford. This is probably the lowest point. As I said, we've had 16 IMF programs, but it never had come to this point. This is crisis that a crisis that we've never felt before. So I think if we don't take that opportunity to change now, we'll keep going back into crisis after crisis. So,
but Dr. Roshan, we are a nation that had good politicians. We had politicians in the caliber of Gamini Dissanayake. We had politicians in the caliber of Lalita Zulanmudali, who were visionary politicians and who spoke about development in the longer run. And today, even the agriculture sector is reaping the benefit of the Mahavali project that was carried out at that time. Look at the reservoirs that are being built. At least now we are talking about energy. We have the biggest hydropower plants in the country that was built a long time ago. Those were built many moons ago, and there were responsible officials in the country at one point. Now the problem is people are electing individuals only for the sake of only for petty agendas to be fulfilled, isn't it? Isn't that the case?
So I think there's this short-term view or short-termism. So we kind of go from one election cycle to another. And I think that's what we need to break, because if you look at any of the countries that have grown in a sustainable manner, that there is consistency of policies across governments. And I think that's what you were alluding to earlier. There needs to be consistency of policies, because otherwise, why would an investor come in? And that's what I was saying. We are resource constrained. We will have to get foreign investments in, because we cannot grow or grow at the level or at the rate that we require in order to pull people out of poverty, in order to reduce inequalities. But to do that, we have to have consistency of policies across government.
Yeah, so if you look at it, Dr. Roshan, I remember last year, probably it was July, August, the Foreign Affairs went on the media and said that he expects the dollar to appreciate against the rupee by 30 to 40 rupees. Now that has not happened. Then we had the governor of the central
Rupee to appreciate.
Yeah, rupee to appreciate, but 20 to 30 rupees. Did that happen, Manjula? It didn't happen. And this is not rocket science. Anyone who looks at the market knows there is still a peg on the interest rate. So, Raj, coming back to you. Now, we're talking about debt restructuring. We talk about very eloquently that debt restructuring is a must as far as foreign debt is concerned. But in terms of local debt restructuring, I think even before the show we spoke about this. Would there be a reprofiling of the treasury bills that we're talking about, or would the government take a haircut on treasury bills going forward when it comes to local debt restructuring as a whole?
Sure. So I think as of now, I think even the governor has maintained radio silence on it. It's not off the table, but there's nothing confirmed on domestic debt restructuring.
I think the state minister said, though, that it's off.
Yes, and we also heard our president say that it is on. So we have conflicting narratives over there. But I think the crux is that do we really need it, and what are the consequences? And one way is to look at what does the IMF have to say about it.
So you're saying this may all come as a surprise one day?
We never know, because we don't even know what the foreign debt negotiations are. We don't know the level of haircut on bilaterals, or nothing has been confirmed yet. So this also could be part of the table. If we delay it further, this could also end up there, because interest rates are significant.
So what happens to people who have invested their money on these treasury bills?
So that is where we need to see, that's where we have to hold government officials accountable, and also get.
You think this is going to happen?
But
holding government officials accountable? but this is Sri Lanka, Raj.
Yeah, but
this is not any other country we're talking about.
Exactly. So I think what we need to see is that what does first of all, I think I need to see what does the IMF have to say about it. So the IMF DSA currently is not public.
So IMF is now governing the country's economic situation in the country, not the government?
Because the government has not published any analysis on domestic debt restructuring. Verite has, we have our own analysis, and we have published.
No, you're saying the IMF is dictating terms.
We need to see what else, what are the
$2.7 billion US dollars?
What are the other options that are there?
Dictating terms. No, you're not answering my question, Raj. So IMF is dictating terms to Sri Lanka?
No, I'm not saying IMF is dictating terms.
But you just
certainly we should. I'm saying what does the IMF have to say on those? So it's not dictating terms. And I think...
But invariably they are.
Because we don't know, because usually they say negotiations, and we don't know who's coming up with the terms. Ideally, it should be Sri Lanka coming up with a plan and making sure...
They say about radio silence, they say about we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. But all this is going to put the people who have invested their hard-earned money into more debt, into more trouble.
But there's also that...
Ultimately, the people have to pay the brunt.
People have to pay the price, and they're already paying the high price, the high inflation, they're already taking a haircut.
But that was a time, Raj. Local interest rate was at 27%, treasury bills were going at 33%. And what people did was they borrowed from the banks and made a gain on treasury bills. That's the high risk level that is involved in the treasury bills, isn't it?
That is true. And I think that's where the riskiness comes in. On like how the domestic debt restructuring is going to happen, and that is where we need to make sure that we do debt restructuring negotiations in such a way where we're able to make sure that debt is sustainable without domestic debt restructuring or with. The question is can we make Sri Lanka's debt sustainable without domestic debt restructuring? And we don't really know that, because Sri Lanka continues to issue debt, and as we prolong this, we might have to do we might have to do even haircuts on domestic debt. But what our analysis says now is that even with a simple reprofiling, you might be able to get away with...
So I'm getting a lot of questions today, Manjula and the panelists today. So I'm this question to Manjula, because Manjula was the one who said we are on the right path. Isn't it quite clear that the right path that is being talked about is clearly the wrong path? Because thousands of people are trying to flee the country.
No, I mean that's unfortunate, because just because you're on the right path, it doesn't mean that you're going to
Manjula,
have
my doctor, who's 64 years old, fled Sri Lanka. He's a consultant.
Probably people don't want to wait till things become better. Because you're not going to. See, we are in the middle of as Roshan explained, the worst ever economic crisis this country has seen, and what maybe most other countries haven't gone through this either. Right, so from that kind of a situation, one cannot really expect to come out in a day or two, right? So when I say we are on the right path, is in contrast to what we saw about a year ago, where we were actually going in the opposite direction, right? And when every one of us was saying, okay, we have to take these steps to come out of this crisis, the government was trying to move in a different direction. So at least we have just got the direction right? But that doesn't mean we are out of the woods. There's still a long way to go, right? If I may just pick up the point on the domestic debt restructuring, Shamil, my thoughts are that I think we should try and avoid that, if at all, if it is possible, because that's going to hurt a lot. It will hurt the depositors, it will hurt the banking system, and I believe the government is at the moment, particularly the central bank, is trying their best to navigate their way without going that far. And in any case, treasury bills are most unlikely to be affected, because in most countries, even where they did domestic debt restructuring,
the government can still continue to print money and give it, no?
I mean, that's one thing, but
Now they can't.
also, I mean, the short-term bills are usually not touched. I mean, it will be the longer-term securities, and you can see the fact
whoever knows about the country's economy will put on short-term bills, and every 3 months review the situation and pull the money out.
Yeah, actually, that's getting factored into the pricing. I mean, that's why today a bank is able to raise deposits at, say, a good bank still pays maybe 20, 26, 25, you know, I mean, ranges from, you know, whatever.
Because they are borrowing it from me and giving to the treasury bills, and they are making 5-6% spread.
Yeah, but that you can do because people are factoring in a haircut. Into that.
Manjula, is Dr. Roshan also can pitch in? Is the dollar being pegged at the moment?
It's being managed, I would say, but maybe you could give a better explanation.
Yeah, so I think, sorry, go ahead.
Not quite pegged, but I mean, there's a slight difference, but maybe Roshan, you can explain further.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, you have to look at the best indicator is actually the black market rate. And if you look at the black market rate, that differential is a little bit more than normal. I mean, what we've been used to maybe
30 to 40 rupees at one point, 60 rupees at one point, but now it's around 7 to 10 rupees.
Exactly. So you can say that the exchange rate is more or less aligned with market forces. But of course, you know that market forces are not completely free.
So the rupee won't crash against the US dollar?
No, we can't say that because there's a tight restrictions. I mean, we've all been talking about these tight restrictions on imports. We are not paying our debts, external debts. So there's huge, huge amount of liabilities that we are not actually even
thought of.
Yes, we are not paying. So if those come into play, then certainly there would be pressure on the exchange rate. So at the moment, because we're managing it in that way, the exchange rate is where it is.
But now with the programs that we're discussing, you know, debt restructuring, getting a haircut on the debt, or extending or reprofiling the debt, those factors will only come into effect about 10 years down the line if we secure a program.
Not necessarily, because I mean, some of them you might push out 10 years, but then there are other things that the multilateral and bilateral creditors, you might have to start repaying some of it. At least the interest payments will have to start being repaid. You might not pay your capital. So there will be some repayment coming into effect, which means that we really need to focus on exports. That I'm going to keep saying that. I think a lot of the policymakers, I mean, focus has been on this, you know, debt restructuring, on that side, on stabilizing the economy, and I think that is important. But we also need to see how do we unleash this economic growth, because how do we increase the potential growth in this country? And for that, I think you also talked about, you know, the barriers and the constraints in the economy, which are on you know, the land reforms, the labor reforms, things that we have been talking about for the financial sector reforms, because there are a lot of things that are restricting, you know, private sector from being able to freely operate in the economy, and also for foreign direct investors to come in, because they look at, you know, the business environment.
Ease of doing business.
Exactly. So I think we need to, in parallel, while we stabilize the economy, I think we really need to be looking at those. And those are the structural reforms we're talking about.
Now, I saw a recent interview a couple of months ago that was done by one of our colleagues, Vasanta Masingage, on the 10 questions, and he interviewed Ajit Niwad Kabral, the former governor of the central bank. He said that we are in this mess today because we declared bankruptcy. Is it so?
Well, as an economist, and I think many economists, that was not the reason why we are in this mess. We declared bankruptcy because we got into an economic mess. I mean, that's my take on it. But certainly, we should have avoided getting to a stage where we're bankrupt, and we could have done that if we had actually.
No, but the explanation that he gave at that point was, if we declared bankruptcy, foreign direct investors, those who provide us loans, won't give us loans. And as a result of that, we automatically fell into this debt trap. And today, we are in this mess because of that reason. Is that a justifiable argument that could be bought over by someone who's worked at the central bank for many, many years.
So if you look at the timeline of how things happened, we cut taxes in 2019, end of 2019, which beginning of 2020, and you could, and soon after, I think it was April or March or April, when the sovereign rating, the sovereign rate. Sovereign rating agencies, they cut our credit our rating to below investment grade. So from that point onward, basically we did not have access to international markets, and no investor, no right-thinking investor would have put their money into this economy. So at that point, really, we should have identified that there was something wrong and reversed whatever policies that we had, that the mistake that we made. But unfortunately, it took another 2 years.
Yeah. So, Dr. Roshan, you spoke about Sri Lanka is a resource deficit nation. Am I right? Yeah. Gajendran, that's very interesting, because you said we are an island nation, we are rich in everything, and then you said, Shamir, you're smiling now. That means that we are very hospitable in nature, so on and so forth. We are, at the end of the day, a resource deficit nation.
Because there are certain essentials we have to import, right?
So just because we are in an island nation, that doesn't mean that everything is okay?
Yeah, so but we have enough resources that when Vietnam also in the 1990s, their export revenue was 3-4 billion. We are from 5 year come only to 10-12. Right? So if you don't, it doesn't mean if to get foreign direct investors here, to make policies for them to enter easy, to do business and exit, easy, we won't be in this position. Where is the Bangladesh is having greater than Cambodia? They had $1 billion. Now they have $17 billion in 2020 when we are having 10. In 1990, they had 1 billion. Cambodia. Myanmar, same story. 1 billion, now 18 billion. Leave aside those countries. We are not, because we are not, even when we make policies, my point is, if you go deep root into it, it is self-seeking, self-interest and self-enhancement.
Manjula, now, the general notion is that in a crisis, not only in a crisis, but generally, the notion is that the private sector is the engine of growth of any country or any economy. Can you say that about Sri Lanka now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, in spite of a very, very challenging environment, right? I mean, it's the private sector which kept the economy growing. I mean, at least, to whatever extent that we saw now, even the exports, we saw the numbers having grown in a absolutely unsupportive environment where we didn't have fuel available. I mean, we had restrictions on inputs, imported inputs. I mean, even in such an environment, right? It's a private sector which somehow kept the economy running, right? So, of course, I mean, it's been a very, very tough call. And
will the banking sector collapse, Manjula?
I don't think. I mean, actually, again, I mean, banks also, you have to admire. I mean, they are going through a very, very difficult period. But they have so far.
But lending has somewhat come to a standstill, right?
Yeah. So that is because they are being very conservative with their lending policies. I mean, they're not being aggressive, which is what they are.
So how will there be a private sector in the country when there are when the interest rates are at 33%, and when the banks in the country are not lending to individuals?
It's a crisis situation, Shamil. So in that situation, they have to also see who has the capacity
to pay back,
to borrow and repay. Right. I mean, if they just liberally go out and dish out, loans at a time like this, I mean, you're going to see the non-performing.
But won't that have a ripple effect on the country, on the bank's balance sheet as well? Because the interest payment is one of the biggest component as far as banks are concerned. When they do not give out loans, and because they're very conservative, as you said before, won't that affect the P&L of a particular bank in question, and won't that affect the payback that the collection of taxes that they have towards this thing, the state.
When these banks don't lend these loans, these people are driven towards these microfinancial institutes, which are some of these institutes are not even registered with the central bank. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's something, so you have to look at it from different angles, right? So because banks also have to make sure that, they are stable, that, because see, in a situation like this, the worst thing that one would, worry about is a bank failing, right? Because if that happens, then it takes you to a different scale of the crisis, right? Today, it has been an economic crisis, but it has not been a financial crisis as such, because we still haven't had a situation like that. So they have to be very careful, right? So it's not that they are not lending, but they are being very selective. So that's what is happening. And I think what we need is now, have more credit lines which are targeting some of these vulnerable groups. We have to get the support of multilateral agencies, like ADB has now come forward with a credit line for the SMEs. Now that's a very good thing. So that's it, again, being channeled through the banking system, where they are able to lend at certain concessionary rates, but fairly small amounts, right? Now one good thing, everybody's talking about the importance of IMF, right? To me, the real the positive there is that if you get that IMF endorsement, we'll get a lot more money coming in through other multilateral agencies, and even a lot of countries we have spoken to. They have said, okay, we are happy to support you, we are willing to support you, but we are waiting for the IMF.
When you speak about multilateral agencies, we're talking about the ADB, we're talking about the World Bank, we're talking about the IMF. What are the other agencies that could lend us money?
Primarily those two, World Bank,
because you said, Manjula,
ADB.
that just because the IMF comes into play, then we will be getting multilateral donors to come and resurrect the country's economy through loans. So what are the agencies that we're talking about?
Yeah, basically three: World Bank, ADB, and IFC also. IFC, which is also part of the World Bank network, and normally they come through the private sector, right? And then there are also a lot of these bilateral agencies, Japan, the European agencies are there, so they are also looking at Sri Lanka. Actually, I know
Japan right now is demanding 5 billion Sri Lankan rupees on the cancellation of the light rail project. Would they give us a loan?
I think the kind of,
I remember when Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed as the president, Navin Dissanayake came on Face the Nation and said, Shamir, give 2 more months. We've had discussions with Japan. Japan is going to invest a lot of money on Sri Lanka.
I think they are. Obviously, I think we have made many mistakes in the past, but
today Japan went to Bangladesh and now they're constructing a light rail project there.
No, they are also being very supportive. Actually, we have to appreciate the role countries like Japan.
No, there is no question about that. The attitude that Sri Lankans have shown towards Japan.
Absolutely. But then I think they will understand. Today it's a different administration, and I'm sure if the IMF gives their endorsement by giving that board approval, I'm very confident that
Raj, countries like Belize have done without the IMF. They've gone through a staff level discussion and then they decided, okay, we won't go with the IMF, we will source our own money at the end of the day. So is that an option that we're talking about as far as Sri Lanka is concerned?
So I think
is that on the table?
They had a very small debt crisis and they restructured a smaller portion of the debt. I think it's about creating confidence. So Sri Lanka, as Manjula said, when IMF comes in, what the IMF does is more than the program money, it is the creation of confidence. And that investors can rely that, okay, the IMF is supporting Sri Lanka's path, so Sri Lanka has some sort of a plan to recover out of the crisis. So creating that confidence is key. And that is why, like Dr. Roshan said, focusing on the economy, focusing on the reforms, and making sure that you can legitimately create investor confidence is key. So I think Sri Lanka is unable to do so given its past history. Like I said earlier, Sri Lanka has never met its own budget targets. Just the government saying that we have a plan doesn't really work because it has never stuck to a plan. So we need...
Are you optimistic about Sri Lanka?
I am optimistic in the sense, It's quite, I can't say I'm optimistic now, but I just feel like Sri Lanka is in the right path with the IMF. Sri Lanka is in the right path with, in terms of debt.
You're very young, Raj.
Yes.
You're very young. You're very young. You probably look at Sri Lanka as a future potential individual. You are the future prospects of this resplendent nation as well, along with the three who are standing right beside me as well. If you had a few $1 million in this current state, would you invest in Sri Lanka?
No.
You won't?
I would, because there is, and I don't think anyone would, investing in Sri Lanka currently now is something that we need, but there is no confidence because you don't know what's going to happen. It's the uncertainty that matters.
If that is to be arrested,
yes,
what must the Sri Lankan government do now?
I always go back to the same problem on we have policy actions without analysis. So you can have policy decisions, but you need to show analysis that this is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve, and this is what I'm trying to do, and here's the math. And that should be made public and should be available for public scrutiny. Ad hoc policy decision making makes it very hard to predict the future. It makes it very hard to say this is what the path is going to be. And Sri Lanka has a history of doing that. So it's very hard to trust the government, and any government that comes in now and says, I'm going to stick to this policy, it's very hard to trust because we keep changing our policies.
Right. So Raj, I'm asking you this question because you are probably the youngest. You are the youngest in the panel today. If things do not turn out the way it should work out or pan out in the next few months, do you see young people on the streets again?
Young people on the streets.
We saw that last year. Will we see something of that sort transpiring again in Sri Lanka?
So again, I am not political or
no. I'm just
expert, but like on a personal
scale. On a personal note.
On a personal note, I think we need some sort of a trigger point to create that. And given the current policies and the path that I hope Sri Lanka would take, that trigger point would most likely not occur. So you would rather, I would rather feel that people would play a waiting game and hope and see the path Sri Lanka is progressing. And it's quite early to comment on that. But I think it's highly unlikely that people, or like at least youngsters, would get on the street anytime soon.
Right. Dr. Roshan, what is the way forward?
As I said, I think it's the economic reform program. I'm just going to keep repeating it because that's what has brought us to where we are, not doing the reforms that program after program that we've been in have identified exactly the same thing. I mean, if you look at programs for the last 3 decades maybe, you'll see similar areas of reform which we have not undertaken. That is the way forward. But I think also we need to stick with it because it's not. I think people need to understand that things are not going to turn around immediately. Things are probably may even get harder before we come out of it. So I think we need to prepare people for that. We also need to cushion the really vulnerable in that scenario. So I think government and bureaucrats, policymakers need to be operating on several fronts because it's kind of all hands on deck and you're shooting on different levels. So I think everybody needs to be aware of what's going on or what needs to be done, and also have the kind of the. I mean, everyone needs to be singing off the same hymn sheet. That's what I'd say, so that we're all moving in the same direction. We can't be having mixed signals, people saying different things. Because otherwise we're not going to get through these reforms because they're difficult. None of this is easy, and that's why we have not done it for 50 years or whatever. It's not easy, but it has to be done.
What attitude change should the people make in this regard when we are moving forward? We talked about many reforms which the political specs have to make, but what attitude change should the people make when moving forward?
So I think I used to always tell people colleagues, friends from other parts of the world that our problems are very small compared to theirs. Now, not necessarily so. But I think Sri Lanka, in that sense, our problems are much smaller than problems in other parts of the world, actually. But the thing is that we need to address them now. We need to take action now. Otherwise, they could get to a stage where it will be very difficult to turn around. And I think that's the attitude that people have to have, that we are willing to go through this pain. And I think also we need to have a reading of history. What have other countries that have gone through these crises? You look at Japan, you look at Korea. I mean, their path was not easy. They had very difficult paths to where they are now, Germany after the war. So I think we have to kind of go back and look at history and see how those countries have come out of those crises. Look at East Asia, even India in the 1990s.
And they say in Korea there was a point that when the government asked for public assistance, the public came with jewelry and gave it to the central bank. And later on, after some time, the central bank had given them back the jewelry in question. Now in Sri Lanka, you can't expect that, can you?
Well, that is a kind of social contract that you need to create, actually. And that is the only way that we can turn this around, where we trust government and the government actually can rely on people to do their bit. I think also, we also, this whole entitlement culture, we kind of expect things easy. We want subsidies, we want, low, everything subsidized.
But then I think, like Gajendra said, that has to come from the top. When you say we expect subsidies,
no, so that's
that comes from the top, doesn't it, Gajendra?
Top and bottom both, isn't it? I mean, see, I think from the people also to address your question, if I may also add a viewpoint, I think our people also have to change, I mean, okay, yes, the top must reform, but that doesn't mean that, that we don't have a role to play. I think everybody, every one of us must feel that, I mean, we have to do what we can do, right? And we can't be dependent on the state for everything, right? I mean, a lot of people still have this entitlement culture that, okay, you get your education free, you get your health free, then you expect the government to give you a job and a pension and give you the fuel, electricity, everything below cost, and you don't have to pay any taxes. So what a fantastic, life. But if everybody is going to live like that, I mean, that society cannot sustain itself. So we also need to understand that.
But then we see today as well. Now we have an election upcoming, but we see this happening today as well. This entitlement culture where they distribute goods at free of charge. So who need to call for this change?
It's a bit of a long process. I think in two ways we have to tackle. In one way, maybe through certain regulations, right? I mean, now this campaign financing bill has come. I think that has some good elements, but not strong enough, according to many who have looked at it. I think some more elements have to come into that. For example, I think we have to bring in some control on the promises that a politician can make before an election, right? Where, I mean, that somebody can't just go out and say that I'm going to give fertilizer free, or I'm going to give,
that happened in the Sri Lankan political stage in 2019.
Absolutely. I mean, at almost every election, right? And that,
no, but actually it's the flip side. They said they will give it for free, and then they said, no, we're not going to give it now.
No, the campaign that was held in Polonnaruwa, the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, said that his brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, had told him to give the fertilizer free. That was the popular sentiment that expressed at that time.
Yeah, and somebody will say something, somebody will also go beyond that and say, okay, somebody says I'll give it for paddy, somebody says no, I will give it for not only paddy but for everything else.
But Manjula, how practical is this, Manjula? Yeah. Has this been done in other countries?
Yeah.
Limiting the promises that a politician can make?
There are some I mean, it's again maybe very hard to implement, but at least, people have made an effort where, okay, you have to support with some numbers or something like that, where you can't just go and make
Manjula, that's a long time coming, because in Sri Lanka, the Elections Commission, the powers of the Elections Commission, of course, are broad, but, it's not broad enough to stop certain, members of the executive from trying to stifle the election process, even asking returning officers not to collect deposits anymore.
I know.
It's a long time coming.
It's a tough call. It's a tough call, and it can't be done only through regulation. So that's why I said, we have to have kind of a twin approach. So on one side, you see how you can bring in some regulations, but at the same time, a big sort of shift in our mindset is also important. So I think that is where the civil society, activists and the media have a role to play. I mean, I know some people actually who are really making an effort. I mean, they're going from town to town, talking to people, trying to convey some of these messages, but I think they need to be given more support, probably more visibility to carry that message across, so that people also understand that we have to start thinking differently. I mean, if the country is to change.
So, Gajendra, I'm not going to ask how old you are, but you definitely remember 22nd of December 1982, do you?
22nd of?
December 1982.
Did something philosophical happen, Shamir?
Sri Lanka's only referendum to be held on the 22nd of December 1982 to extend the parliament term by 6 years, and J.R. Jayawardena at that time went for the referendum. And a few months later, we saw the July 23rd, the Black July, taking place in Sri Lanka. That was on the 23rd of July, 1983, which is the famous day in the Sri Lankan calendar. Do you think even this time around, something of that sort is going to happen in terms of the elections, Gajendra?
When you said 22nd December, you foxed me.
I did.
Because that was my date of birth, so I was wondering.
And I'm so glad that you were not born in 1982, Gajendra.
So I was wondering where we were getting to. So my mind collapsed for a moment, right?
But then you should not forget 22nd of December 1982.
Now I won't remember. I will not forget. Samir, now listening to, you would have spoken to so many people, even listening to us. We know our problems, don't we? We know our challenges, don't we? We know the solutions. All of us are different, so we are saying solution. If you know the problem, these are not rocket science. You know the problems, you know the solutions. My question is, why from here to here you are not moving?
Gajendra, very good question. Just to add to that, you said we know the problems, we know the solutions, but I think the real problem is the people who can bring the changes don't know the problems.
No, they know the problems.
For example, Gajendra,
they know the problems.
One issue, this
power crisis. They don't.
They know the problems, they know the solutions. This is my same point. You won't make those decisions to solve those problems, to get this. If you want, we have the institutions, if the institution is not working. Why are you not having a policy? Why don't you have a think tank? Why don't you have resource-based granular analysis? Don't you think you can do it? No. If you do it, you have to walk that talk.
No, but do you think, Gajendran, there will be an election this year? Would this be an election year for Sri Lanka?
I think election will be held. At least this election will be held.
The local government election.
Would
held. That be a litmus test to gauge the people's aspirations and the rejection, or whether they are supporting the government in power?
Definitely that has been always an indicative factor world over. Midterm elections, it's a world over indicative factor.
Let's say the people voice their opposition and the government in power. Now we know the UNP and the SLPP are going to jointly contest the local government elections if that is held. That's the agreement that they have arrived at the moment. In the event the people reject the government in play, that is the SLPP and the UNP right now, do you think it would be prudent for the president to even go for a general election? Because after March this year, the president could go for a general election to see and get the people's mandate for the
I would know how those decisions will be made by whoever it is, whether the president or the team or the parliament will make. But there will come to a point that the politicians will have to listen to the voices of the people. You know, ultimately it's the sovereign people, the sovereignty is the sovereign of the people.
Sovereignty has to reign supreme.
It has to reign supreme, and end of the day, it has to be the deciding factor. It has to direct. It has.
Gajendra, now I know you probably will not like to answer this question, but I'm still posing it to you. You can duck that question if you want to, as you have done in the past and in this program.
You must tell me when I'm ducking.
Right, I would. I told you before as well, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Do you think chambers, national chambers in Sri Lanka have done their part?
But national chambers?
National chambers in Sri Lanka have done their part.
You must understand.
Don't you think they have a bigger role to play? And like the GMOA, for an example, do you think they have a bigger role to play in this decisive juncture?
Now, can I get a little philosophical?
Of course you do.
But
you always are.
Polonis said, be true to yourself, right? Be true to the die, you true to yourself. And he said a person if a person can't do harm, right, the person cannot do harm if he is going to do good. And if that is to happen, he said, it is first take care of yourself and thereafter take care of others. So when human beings, it is nothing wrong that when they want to make decisions, they will have to first look after themselves.
So I have one more.
No, one minute. Yeah. Chambers also, businesses, first of all, they have to look after themselves. When you are empowered, even Mahatma Gandhi said, the people who build, you have to protect the people who build resources, wealth, because they are the people who can help. But my point is, when people come into position of trust in fiduciary responsibility, then self-interest, self-seeking, self-enhancing cannot happen. You can't expect the businesses to forget their business, their stakeholders, their shareholders.
That should not be there.
No, it's not. First they have to look after themselves, empower themselves, then you have to look after them.
I have one question for Dr. Roshan before we part for the day. Why is Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe so silent now? I don't see him anymore.
I have seen a few conversations with him, but I wouldn't be able to answer that question because.
So why don't you invite him, Anadi?
That's good.
Of course. Well, we have invited him before. He had come on the show. We've been able to ask him questions about the debt restructuring, and that is why I said earlier on in the show that he committed that this is going to come faster. That's by December, and he told me, Shamir, wait and see. It's going to come in December, and we are still waiting. As Raj says, we are yet to see, and we are waiting until the cows jump over the moon, Gajendra. So thank you very much, Raj Prabhu, for joining us this evening. Raj is the Senior Research Analyst at Verity Research. Dr. Roshan Pereira joining us after some time. Thank you very much. She is the Senior Research Fellow at Advocata Institute and was also affiliated with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Manjula De Silva, how can I forget you, Manjula? You've always been coming on the show expressing the views of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the CEO of the Chamber, and N.R. Gajendran, a tax specialist cum philosopher, for joining us on this show. Our task is to ensure that the people get to know what's happening around the country with regard to current affairs. Today we spoke about the reality concerning the country's economy. Today we are getting 20 liters of petrol for a week, or diesel or fuel for a week, 2.5 hours of power cuts. Is that enough? Should that be the status quo? And at what cost is all this coming at? Is this the reality that we're talking about? Some points to ponder tonight. Thank you very much, Ruhaza. Thank you very much, Charlan, attorney at law. I should not forget that. and attorney at law Ravindra Jayakodi as well. Both of them took oaths, was called to the bar a couple of months ago. We are very proud that both of them are part of the Newsfirst team, very young journalists asking the questions that matter to the public. So thank you very much, the two gentlemen. And of course, I should not forget Ruaza, one of our senior producers at Newsfirst. Thank you very much, Ruaza, for joining us this evening on the show as well. Very young. This is the time that Sri Lanka has to look at young people, and that is where people like Raj come into play as well. So I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. The greatest glory in living lies not in never failing, but in rising every time we fall. Take care and good night, because the fall is very, very steep. Take care.